Maybe you don't make the lemonade right.
Well, we don't want to rush you. Maybe you'll want some after our first big number.
The rest is the musical. Come on, my friends, get...
Take it easy and eat plenty of while we put on our next sensational act. Gee whiz! No.
What happened to the Little Rascals? 1922. Cast tragic deaths Hollywood tried to hide. Do you remember the first time you saw them, those muddy faces? Those crooked hats? That pure? Ridiculous. Beautiful laughter coming out of a black and white screen like it was the most natural thing in the world. For millions of American kids, the Little Rascals weren't just a TV show. They were Saturday mornings. They were summer afternoons. They were the feeling that childhood had no end date. That somewhere out there a gang of kids was always getting into trouble and always coming out the other side with a grin. But here's what nobody told you. One of them was shot dead over a $50 debt, and Hollywood looked the other way. One was a little girl the whole country adored, and the studio that made her famous may have quietly destroyed her body before she ever reached 50 years old. And one of them, a boy who fell all the way down into heroin in prison, clawed his way back out and became something nobody saw coming. The Little Rascals? 1922. America's most beloved children. And behind every single smile on that screen, there was a story that Hollywood worked very, very hard to make sure you never found out about. So today, we're going behind that screen. We're telling the whole truth. And we're giving these people back the dignity that the industry stole from them. Let's start with the one that hits hardest right out of the gate. Carl Switzer, Alfalfa. At 8 years old, this kid walked onto the Our Gang set and he just owned it. No warm-up, no nerves. He looked into that camera like he'd been doing it his whole life. Because in a way, he had Bursto, Alfalfa, the squeaky-voiced, cowlick-haired, completely delusional, romantic, who serenaded Darla with the confidence of a Broadway star and the vocal talent of a drowning cat wasn't a character someone invented. That was Carl. That was just who he was. And audiences loved him for it. By the late 1930s, Carl Switzer had actually outpaced Spanky in popularity. The kid who couldn't carry a tune had become the most beloved face in the whole franchise. But here's the thing about fame in early Hollywood. It wasn't a gift. It was a lease. And at some point, they always came to collect. By his 20s, Carl was gone from the spotlight, and the fall was not graceful. He was surviving on odd jobs. Dog training, hunting guide work, whatever kept the rent paid. In 1954, he married into money a wealthy heiress. A fresh start. A son he clearly loved. It looked like a rescue story for a minute there. It lasted 3 years. By 1957, the marriage was over. The money was gone. The stability he thought he'd finally found gone. And then in January of 1958, while Carl was sitting in his car outside a bar, someone shot him in the arm. An unknown gunman. An attack that was never solved. Never explained. Nobody was ever charged. Carl kept going. Most people would have sat down after that. Carl kept going. Then a few months later, he gets arrested in Sequoia National Forest for illegally cutting down 15 pine trees to sell as Christmas trees. Pine trees. For cash. That's where Alfalfa was. But even then, he kept going. On January 21st, 1959, Carl Switzer went to confront an old friend named Moses Bud Stilts over a small debt. $50 connected to a hunting dog reward. That was the number. $50. The argument turned violent inside Stilts' home in Mission Hills. A .38 caliber revolver was fired. The bullet tore through Carl's groin and ruptured a major artery. Carl Alfalfa Switzer was pronounced dead at the hospital at 7:27 in the evening. He was 31 years old. The shooting was ruled self-defense. Witnesses at the scene later questioned that conclusion. The truth, whatever it actually was, died with him. He was buried at Hollywood Forever Cemetery, the boy who made the whole country laugh. Gone at 31, with a net worth of essentially zero, $50. That's what Alfalfa's life ended over. $50. Now let's talk about the leader, George McFarland, Spanky, 3 years old. The kid was 3 years old when he first stepped in front of a camera and commanded it like a seasoned professional. Spanky, the sharp-tongued, fast-thinking, bossy little general who ran the gang like he was born to do exactly that, wasn't just a popular character. He was the spine of the entire series, the anchor that held everything together. And for a child who became famous before he could write his own name, that kind of identity comes with a cost that keeps compounding interest for decades. Think about what that does to a person. Every room you walk into for the rest of your life, people don't see you. They see the kid in the beanie. They see Spanky. They want Spanky. And the gap between who you actually are and who they insist you still are, that gap gets wider every year. And it never stops being painful. George McFarland did what he could. He married. He tried to build a quiet life away from the cameras. He showed up at reunion events and joked about the old days. Because what else are you supposed to do when the audience only loves one version of you? But behind the jokes, former colleagues described a man who seemed exhausted, withdrawn, like someone carrying something heavy that he'd stopped trying to put down. On June 30th, 1993, George Spanky McFarland suffered a heart attack at his home in Grapevine, Texas. He was 64 years old. 64? That's it. The boy who led the gang, who made the whole series work, who gave American children their fearless little general, 64 years old in a house in Texas, far from the screens that made him famous. Spanky deserved more. He gave America its leader, and America gave him a legacy he could never escape. Now here's one that doesn't get talked about enough. Billy Thomas. Buckwheat. 4 years old when he became one of the most recognizable faces in American entertainment. That voice, that hair, that wide-eyed expression that could stop you cold in the middle of a scene. Billy Thomas had something you genuinely cannot teach. A natural screen presence that most adult actors spend their entire careers trying to develop. And then, he walked away from it. After Our Gang ended, Billy didn't chase Hollywood. He didn't do the desperate audition circuit. He went to work at Technicolor behind the scenes. Invisible, completely out of the spotlight. And by all accounts, that was exactly where he wanted to be. But the stories that followed him out of that studio were not quiet stories. Former crew members later claimed, and this was never officially confirmed. So take it for what it is, that the young Billy had occasionally been given syrups laced with mild sedatives during long takes. To keep him still. To keep him cooperative. To keep him usable on camera. Whether that's true or not, the people who were closest to Billy in adulthood said he struggled with hand tremors and nervous tension for years. And he never talked about it. Not once. Not publicly. He took whatever happened on those sets and he carried it alone. In silence. For the rest of his life. On October 10th, 1980, Billy Thomas died of a heart attack at his Los Angeles home. He was 49 years old. But here's the detail that gets me every time. Just 10 weeks before he died, Billy had stood on a stage at a Hollywood gathering honoring the Our Gang cast. The audience gave him a standing ovation. A full standing ovation. And it moved him to tears right there on that stage. 10 weeks later, he was gone. Some exits have no justice in them at all. That's just the truth. Now I need to tell you about Darla. Because Darla Hood's story might be the one that makes you angriest. She was 4 years old when she became the heart of the Little Rascals. Sweet, sharp, confident, with a voice that could fill a room and a screen presence that made every scene she was in feel warmer. Her chemistry with Alfalfa became one of the most beloved dynamics in the entire history of the franchise. People didn't just like Darla. They adored her. And from the very beginning, the studio made sure she knew exactly what her job was. Stay small. Stay pretty. Stay perfect. That was the deal. Off screen. That pressure never left. Darla kept performing into adulthood. Nightclubs. Television. Reunions. She kept singing. She kept showing up. She kept playing the part of someone who was doing just fine. But people close to her described a woman who was quietly consumed by anxiety about her appearance and her weight, an obsession that reportedly stretched all the way back to her earliest days on those studio sets. When staying small and polished wasn't a preference or a suggestion, it was a requirement for keeping the job. Dark rumors circulated for years that she had been pushed hard from childhood to stay a certain way, and that the obsession with appearance had grown into something far more damaging over the decades. And then came the ending that makes absolutely no sense. In 1979, while Darla was actively organizing the Little Rascals reunion, putting it together, reaching out to castmates, building something that was supposed to celebrate the people she'd grown up with, she went in for a routine appendectomy. Routine. That was the word people used. A routine procedure. She never came home. On June 13th, 1979, Darla Hood died of heart failure following hepatitis contracted from a contaminated blood transfusion during that surgery. She was 47 years old. A routine operation. A contaminated transfusion. And the girl who gave the Little Rascals its warmth and its heart was gone before the reunion she was building ever happened. 47 years old. Okay, I need you to stay with me for this next one, because this one goes in a completely different direction. This one is about a boy who fell all the way to the bottom and then did something that almost nobody in his position ever manages to do. Matthew Beard. Stymie, 5 years old when he became the smooth-talking, derby hat-wearing, coolest kid in the entire gang. Stymie didn't run around and yell like the others. He observed. He processed. He delivered his lines with the kind of calm timing that professional comedians spend decades learning. In a cast full of natural performers, Matthew Beard was on another level. And while he was doing all of that, while he was making America laugh every week, he was also quietly carrying the financial weight of a family of 13 siblings on a child's paycheck. 13. That's not a typo. 13 siblings, depending on what a 5-year-old could earn in front of a camera. When the roles dried up, the pressure didn't. Matthew drifted. The stability disappeared. He got into trouble. A marijuana habit became something much darker. And by the time anyone really noticed, he was deep into a heroin addiction that sent him in and out of jail for years. Years. While the world still remembered the charming kid in the oversized derby hat, Matthew Beard was trying to survive something that kills most people who go through it. And here's where his story breaks away from every other story on this list. He fought back. Matthew Beard entered Synanon, a controversial rehabilitation program in Los Angeles, and he broke the addiction. He actually broke it. He came out the other side. He rebuilt his life. He got back on television, Sanford and Son. Good times. The Buddy Holly story. He came back. I want you to understand what that means. This is a man who had every reason in the world to give up, who had been failed by the industry that made him famous, failed by the system, failed by the people who were supposed to protect him, and he got back up anyway. That is not a small thing. That is one of the most remarkable things on this entire list. On January 3rd, 1981, just 2 days after his 56th birthday, Matthew Beard suffered a stroke and fell down a staircase. He died days later from pneumonia complications. He was buried at Evergreen Cemetery in Los Angeles. And they placed his legendary derby hat right beside him. Hollywood never gave Matthew Beard a second chance. He gave it to himself. That is the version of this story that deserves to be remembered forever. Now I have to tell you about the one that made me genuinely furious when I went back and looked at the details. Norman Chaney. Chubby, 14 years old when he played the heavyset. Slow burning. Endlessly frustrated Chubby, whose expressions could make an entire audience collapse. His comic timing was instinctive. His presence was completely unique. There was nobody else who could have played that role the way Norman played it. And the studio knew exactly which part of him to use. Chubby's body wasn't just his look on that screen. It was his entire value to the people who employed him. And here's what they knew or should have known and apparently didn't care enough to address. Norman Chaney could not stop gaining weight. Even when he was eating normally and exercising, his body was fighting a glandular illness. A medical condition. Something that needed actual treatment from actual doctors. Instead, dark stories later emerged, suggesting that people around the production had actively encouraged the image, kept leaning into it, because it was funny on camera. By the time Norman finally got to Johns Hopkins for real medical treatment, his weight had surged past 300 pounds on a frame that never grew past 4 feet and 7 inches tall. The treatment they gave him crashed his weight down to under 140 pounds in just a few months. That kind of sudden. Extreme change destroys a body, and it destroyed his. Norman Chubby Chaney died on May 29, 1936. He was 21 years old. And then, and I need you to really hear this part, his grave sat unmarked for 76 years. 76 years. Because his mother could not afford a headstone, a boy whose face was known across the entire country, a boy who made millions of people laugh. Unmarked. Forgotten. For 76 years. Only in 2012 did a fundraising effort finally place black granite markers for Norman and his mother. Some stories don't have a quiet ending. They have a verdict. And the verdict on what happened to Norman Chaney is damning. Let me tell you about the one who made it out. Jackie Cooper. 7 years old in our gang. And his natural screen presence was so extraordinary, so far beyond what anyone expected from a child, that Hollywood pulled him out of the gang almost immediately and pointed him at a solo career. By age 9, he had an Academy Award nomination. 9 years old. The most gifted natural child actor of his entire generation. That is not an exaggeration. That is the consensus of everyone who worked with him or watched him work. But the machine that built Jackie Cooper also did something to him that he carried for the rest of his life. On the set of Skippy, director Norman Torog needed real tears from his young star for a critical scene, and instead of working with the child, instead of finding a way to reach that emotion naturally, the director told young Jackie that his dog had been shot. The performance that followed was devastating. It was exactly what they needed. It was perfect for the scene. And the damage it left behind lasted far longer than any scene ever could. Jackie Cooper spent the rest of his life carefully, quietly hinting at what early Hollywood was actually like for the children inside it. He never made sensational claims. He never went on talk shows and made headlines with accusations. But the things he said, the careful, restrained, measured things he said, painted a picture of an industry where adults cross lines with children regularly, and where children had no power to say anything about it. The silence itself was testimony. Jackie Cooper went on to build a remarkable life. A long career. Real success. A net worth of $18 million by the time he died. He proved that a person can take everything that was done to them in childhood and still build something worth having. On May 3rd, 2011, Jackie Cooper died in Santa Monica, California. He was 88 years old. He outlived almost every story that tried to define him, and that victory belonged entirely to him. One more, and this one is the shortest life on this entire list. Billy Laughlin. Froggy, 8 years old when he gave our gang that voice, that rasping, croaking, completely impossible voice that made Froggy one of the strangest and most genuinely unforgettable characters in the series. You heard Froggy before you saw him? You always knew exactly who was in the scene. Off camera, Billy was something very different from what you might expect. No drama. No desperation. No clinging to the spotlight after the camera stopped. When our gang ended, he tried a few auditions, appeared briefly in one film, and then told his mother quietly and clearly, "This isn't my future anymore." That kind of self-awareness in a child shaped by a Hollywood set is so rare it almost doesn't seem real. Disturbing rumors later claimed that studio personnel had pushed Billy to strain that voice even further than it naturally went to shout until it sounded rougher. More bizarre. More useful for the comedic effect they were building around him. Whether that's true, it fits the same pattern that shows up in every single story on this list. On August 31st, 1948, Billy Laughlin was riding as a passenger on a motor scooter during a newspaper delivery route in La Cañada, California. The scooter turned into the path of a speeding truck. Billy was taken to the hospital. He died 6 hours later. Billy Froggy Laughlin was 16 years old. No fortune, no unfinished comeback. No decades of trying to figure out who he was after the camera stopped. Just that voice, still playing. Still crackling out of old speakers and old films. Decades and decades after the boy who made it was gone. Now, step back for a second and look at all of this together. Because when you lay these stories side by side, a pattern emerges that is impossible to ignore. Shot at 31. Dead at 16 from a road accident on a delivery route. Killed by a contaminated blood transfusion during routine surgery at 47. A glandular condition left untreated, while a studio kept using the result for laughs. A voice reportedly pushed past its limits for a joke. An unmarked grave for 76 years. Hollywood didn't call any of this harm. Hollywood called it entertainment. These children were given fame before they had any capacity to understand what they were trading for it. They were directed, scheduled, photographed, and monetized. They carried their families. They carried the weight of public images they never chose. And when the studios finished with them, the credits rolled and the lights went dark. Some of them broke. Some of them were broken by forces they couldn't see or name or fight. But some of them, and this is what Hollywood really didn't want you to see, some of them got back up. Matthew Beard walked out of heroin addiction and came back to a screen that had forgotten him. Jackie Cooper built $18 million and 88 years of life out of an industry that used a child's grief as a production tool. Alan Hoskins, born into a racial climate so hostile that the studio assigned him a bodyguard just to protect him on set, quietly walked away from a Hollywood that had no more use for him, and spent his later years helping young people recover from addiction and mental illness. He chose service over fame, every single time, for the rest of his life. That is what Hollywood buried. Not just the tragedies, the dignity, the resilience, the full human beings behind those small faces on that old black and white screen. They were children. They made you laugh before you were old enough to understand what laughter costs the person performing it. And now you know what was behind that screen. So, tell me which story hit you the hardest. Which one of these kids do you think about differently now that you know the full truth? Because these weren't cast members. These weren't characters. These were real people who deserved real lives. Some of them never got the chance to find out what that felt like. If you believe these lives deserve to be remembered, not hidden, not cleaned up, not softened for the sake of a studio's reputation, but remembered exactly as they were, share this with someone who grew up watching them on that screen. They gave you their childhoods. The very least we can do is give them back the truth.